It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend at my cabin. Just me, the woods, and silence. But then, out of nowhere, the HOA president stormed up my driveway, banging on my door like she owned the place. "Open up!" she yelled. "I demand to inspect your property." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No." That one word, "no," set off a chain reaction I never could have imagined. She lost it, screaming, threatening, calling the sheriff, all because I refused to give in. What followed wasn't just a dispute. It turned into a battle for my rights, my land, and my peace of mind. And let me tell you, I wasn't backing down. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat. It had always been that, a place of peace, quiet, and complete disconnection from the chaos of everyday life. Nestled at the edge of a private, wooded community, it was far enough from the city to feel like another world entirely. A small porch, a wood-burning fireplace, and nothing but trees and birdsong all around. This was paradise, or at least it used to be. Things changed the moment the Homeowners Association started getting involved. The community had never been heavily regulated, and the HOA existed more in name than function. But about 6 months ago, a new president was elected, and everything took a sharp turn. Her name was Patricia, and from the start, she made it clear that her interpretation of community standards was more about control than care. Weekly emails began to flood inboxes, each more demanding than the last. Everything from mandatory porch paint colors to regulations about firewood stacking and curtain visibility from the road. Still, I figured none of that would apply to my cabin. I was well within my rights. The property had been in my family for years, long before the HOA existed. It was on the outskirts of the neighborhood, and technically didn't even fall under the original zoning restrictions. I had checked and double-checked every document. I paid no fees. I had no obligation to comply. But that didn't stop Patricia from trying to make me an example. I arrived on a Friday afternoon with the usual plan in mind: disconnect, read, maybe do a little fishing. Everything was calm for about 24 hours. Then, without warning, she appeared. No text, no email, no call, just showed up, striding up the path like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on despite the cloudy sky, and that expression she always wore, one of permanent suspicion. She didn't say hello or ask how I was. Her first words were direct, sharp, and impossible to ignore. "You need to unlock this cabin." Confused, I asked her why. Her tone didn't change. "There have been reports," she said flatly. "I need to inspect the inside of the property to ensure it complies with community safety standards." That made no sense. First of all, no one had access to my cabin. Second, even if they did, what exactly did she mean by safety standards? There had been no prior warnings, no documents served, no inspection notices. It wasn't even her jurisdiction. I reminded her calmly that my cabin wasn't part of the active HOA zone, and that I wasn't legally bound to let anyone inside. Her expression darkened. She flipped a few pages on her clipboard and waved it in my direction as if that would somehow override the facts. "According to this," she snapped, "you're still within the borders of our community. That means I have every right to make sure your property isn't a danger to others." I stood my ground and repeated that she was mistaken. I had copies of the original property lines, and I'd had a lawyer review them a few years ago when a similar situation had come up. I was out of reach of HOA rules, plain and simple. Her authority stopped well short of my door. That's when things escalated. She raised her voice, insisted that I was being uncooperative, and threatened to report me to the full board. When I didn't budge, she stepped closer and demanded I unlock the door immediately. I told her no again, firmly this time. Her jaw clenched. She muttered something about non-compliance and took out her phone, furiously typing into what I assumed was some kind of HOA app or community message board. At this point, it was clear she wasn't just inspecting for safety. She was trying to assert dominance. She thought that by showing up unannounced and acting like an authority figure, I'd cave in and do what she wanted. But I knew my rights. And more importantly, I knew how people like her operated. It was never about safety. It was about control. I offered to email her copies of the zoning exemption. I told her again that she had no right to demand entry, and that if she continued to harass me, I'd involve law enforcement. That got her attention. For a brief second, she hesitated, but then she laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made it clear she thought she was untouchable. "You can try," she said, "but I have the backing of the entire HOA. We'll see how far that gets you." She turned and marched off without another word, leaving behind a tense silence that hung in the air like smoke. I stood there, staring after her, a mix of frustration and disbelief bubbling just beneath the surface. This was supposed to be my safe place, my quiet place. And now it was under siege by someone who thought a clipboard gave her power over the law. I had a feeling this wasn't over, and I was right. By the next morning, I thought maybe Patricia had come to her senses. Maybe she'd gone home, reread the bylaws, realized she had no authority over my cabin, and decided to move on to another target. But that illusion was shattered before breakfast. Just after sunrise, while I was inside preparing coffee, a loud, persistent knock echoed through the cabin, the kind that wasn't just about getting attention. It was about asserting dominance. I didn't need to open the door to know who it was. When I did, she was already mid-sentence, clipboard in one hand, a stack of papers in the other, and a fury in her eyes that made it clear she was not finished with me. She declared with absolute certainty that I was in violation of community access standards and was now considered non-compliant. I asked her once again to clarify which section of the HOA bylaws she was referring to. She didn't answer. Instead, she thrust a stapled packet of documents into my hand. They were photocopies of vaguely worded policies, most of which had nothing to do with privately owned cabins or non-residential structures. It was a patchwork of cherry-picked excerpts from the HOA manual, none of which applied to me. Still, she spoke with the tone of someone who believed every word was law. She said that by refusing her entry, I had opened myself up to formal action and possible penalties. She claimed that the HOA board had authorized her to inspect my cabin to ensure code compliance and structural safety. I reminded her again, firmly and without hesitation, that she had no jurisdiction here. My cabin sat on land that had never been under HOA governance. It wasn't built on a community lot. It didn't use shared resources, and no legal document tied me to their policies. Patricia didn't like being challenged. She raised her voice, calling my refusal hostile and a threat to the community. She warned that if I didn't cooperate voluntarily, she would escalate the matter to what she called the Enforcement Committee. I'd never heard of such a thing in any of the HOA documentation I'd reviewed in the past. It was clear she was making things up as she went. Her logic, such as it was, hinged on the notion that if the community was nearby, and if the HOA existed, then she had blanket authority over every structure and person within walking distance. Her rhetoric became more aggressive. She accused me of harboring unsafe conditions in the cabin, without a shred of evidence. She said that neighbors had raised concerns about strange behavior, though refused to specify who these alleged neighbors were. When I asked for proof, she said it was confidential. When I asked for the names of the board members who had supposedly approved this inspection, she brushed me off, saying it was an internal matter. It was like trying to reason with a wall. She wasn't interested in facts, only in control. She wasn't there to inspect anything. She was there to break me down, to make me submit, to watch me fumble for keys and surrender to her authority. But I didn't. I repeated what I had told her the day before. She had no legal standing, no jurisdiction, and no right to force her way into a privately owned residence. I told her that if she tried again, I would take legal action. Her response was laced with a smirk. She said that non-compliance had consequences, and that I was making a serious mistake. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She reached for the handle of the cabin door. I stopped her before she could touch it. I didn't raise my voice or threaten her. I just stood firm and said, "Don't." That's when she finally lost the thin veneer of politeness she'd been clinging to. Her calm, calculated demeanor crumbled. She began shouting about how people like me were the reason the community was going downhill. She claimed that by refusing inspection, I was inviting vermin, black mold, and fire hazards into the neighborhood. The accusations were absurd, laughable even, but her tone was deadly serious. She called me selfish, irresponsible, and a blight on the community. And all I had done was stay in my own cabin. At that point, she pulled out her phone. She announced loudly that she was documenting the incident and taking video for evidence. I told her to go ahead. I had nothing to hide. But her tone shifted again, now more performative, like she was building a case for an audience. She panned her phone around the cabin, muttering fabricated violations into the camera as if she were a government inspector conducting an official investigation. It would have been laughable if it weren't so disturbing. Then came the threat that crossed the line. She said she would involve the sheriff's department and report me for obstruction. I told her she was free to make any report she wanted, but she should be prepared to explain her own actions when the officers asked what authority gave her the right to enter private property without consent. I offered once again to provide copies of my property documents to the sheriff and told her flatly that if she continued this behavior, I would press harassment charges. She stared at me for a long moment, weighing whether to continue. Her eyes flickered with hesitation, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She stormed off, muttering into her phone, possibly texting other board members or trying to rally support for her crusade. I watched her disappear down the trail, a rigid silhouette full of self-righteous indignation. What struck me most wasn't her aggression. It was her certainty, this unshakable belief that she was the law, that no one could say no to her. that her position gave her dominion over people's lives and properties. She didn't care about rules unless they served her agenda. She didn't care about property rights unless she could bend them to her will. In her mind, I wasn't a property owner. I was an obstacle. That day made something very clear. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a battle of wills. She had chosen me as her target, and now that I had stood up to her, she would do everything in her power to make me regret it. But she underestimated one thing. I wasn't afraid of her title, her threats, or her clipboard. I had the truth, the documents, and the law on my side, and I wasn't backing down. The morning after Patricia's second attempt to force her way into my cabin, things took a darker turn. I had expected her to regroup, maybe consult her HOA handbook, and realize how far out of line she'd stepped. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. Around mid-morning, I began receiving messages. Anonymous numbers, texting vague threats, all phrased suspiciously like the HOA's usual tone. You are creating legal exposure for the community. Non-compliance will lead to serious consequences. It would be wise to cooperate before further steps are taken. I wasn't intimidated, but I was now certain Patricia wasn't working alone. She had clearly begun mobilizing her influence, spreading misinformation, and rallying whatever allies she had on the HOA board. The phrasing of the texts was all smoke and mirrors, clearly written to sound official without actually stating anything legally actionable. That kind of language only works on people who don't know better. I had already spoken to a lawyer after her first visit, and knew exactly where the lines were drawn. She could posture all she wanted. She had no legal leverage, but intimidation was her weapon of choice, and the more I resisted, the more aggressive she became. Around noon, I saw her pacing near the property line with another woman, someone I didn't recognize. They walked up and down the gravel road, pointing toward the cabin and snapping pictures. They weren't subtle about it. It was all designed to send a message. We're watching. By early afternoon, the real escalation happened. A black SUV pulled up, and 2 sheriff's deputies stepped out. My heart jumped for a moment, not because I was afraid, but because I knew what this meant. Patricia had officially involved law enforcement, likely under some fabricated claim about community safety or a disturbance. I stepped out to greet the officers calmly, knowing that facts were my best defense. To their credit, the deputies were professional from the start. They said they had received a report from a community representative, stating how there had been a possible dispute over access and safety concerns related to a cabin in the area. Patricia, who had trailed behind them with an air of triumph, began chiming in before they could finish. She started listing off her usual script: non-compliance, dangerous conditions, community risk, refusal to cooperate. But the deputies stopped her mid-sentence. One of them turned to me and asked directly, "Is this your property, sir?" I confirmed that it was, and presented my deed, tax documents, and legal description of the property line, all of which clearly stated that the land was not under HOA jurisdiction. I explained that the HOA had no authority here, and that the individual making these claims had already been told to leave the premises the day before. The deputy took the documents, looked them over for a few minutes, then glanced back at Patricia. She was visibly fuming. Her arms were crossed, her foot tapping in the gravel, the smirk from earlier completely gone. She tried again to explain that the community had the right to ensure all residences were safe and up to code, even if they weren't officially under HOA coverage. The deputy asked her plainly, "Do you have a court order, warrant, or any legal documentation that gives you access to his private property?" Patricia froze. She tried to deflect, saying it was a civil issue, but the damage was done. The officer handed my documents back and turned to me, saying, "You're within your rights. She has no legal standing to demand access. If she returns to the property or continues harassing you, call us immediately." Patricia stood speechless for a moment, trying to regroup. Then, as if she couldn't stop herself, she launched into a final, desperate tirade. She shouted that the neighborhood was being undermined by rogue residents, that people like me endangered everyone else, that the sheriff's department was enabling negligence. The deputies didn't take the bait. They simply reminded her she was on private property and advised her to leave. As she turned to walk away, she snapped photos of everything in sight: the cabin, the driveway, even the license plate on my truck. I had no doubt she'd be emailing the board within minutes, spinning this incident as her being stonewalled by an unruly resident. That was fine. I had documentation, I had the law on my side, and now I had a record of her calling the police under false pretenses. What really struck me was how far she was willing to go over something that didn't involve her. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about community standards. It was about ego, power, and her desire to prove that no one could say no to her. The fact that I had stood my ground threatened her image, and she was determined to crush that threat at all costs. But she had made one fatal mistake. She brought in the law. And the law didn't see a dangerous resident. It saw a landowner defending his rights from someone pretending to have power. Later that evening, I spoke to a neighbor down the road who had overheard the commotion. He told me Patricia had been bragging at the last HOA meeting about cleaning up the community, and had apparently mentioned me by name. She had been planning this for weeks, trying to set an example that would keep everyone else in line. What she hadn't planned on was resistance. Over the next few days, I began documenting everything. I compiled a full written account of the encounters, saved screenshots of the text threats, copied the property records, and created a secure folder with all relevant materials. If she tried anything further, fines, harassment, or legal claims, I would be ready. The tension hadn't ended. If anything, it had just shifted into a new phase. Patricia wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She would regroup, reorganize, and try again. But now, the balance had changed. Her mask had slipped in front of witnesses. Her credibility was shaken. And the more she pushed, the more obvious her personal vendetta became. This wasn't over. But for the first time since it began, I wasn't the one on the defensive.
Over the following week, Patricia kept a suspicious silence. No knocks, no visits, no text messages, nothing. It should have been a relief, but instead, it felt like the eerie calm before a storm. People like her didn't just walk away after being publicly put in their place. They regrouped, they recalibrated, and they always came back with a new strategy. I knew something was brewing. I just didn't know how far she was willing to take it. Then, on Thursday morning, I received a formal letter from the HOA. Not an email, an actual envelope left in my cabin's mailbox. It wasn't stamped or delivered by the post office. It had clearly been placed there by hand. The letter claimed that I was now being assessed for continued non-compliance with emergency community access protocols, and stated that a hearing had been scheduled to review actions taken in violation of HOA governance standards. According to the letter, Failure to attend could result in sanctions, including fines and restrictions on property access. It was laughable on the surface, but also infuriating. The letter had no legal weight. I wasn't under their jurisdiction. The entire thing was a bluff. Another attempt to bully me into submission through a wall of bureaucratic noise. But it proved that Patricia hadn't given up. She was simply trying a different angle, using HOA procedure as a weapon of harassment. I contacted my attorney again, and he immediately sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, specifically naming Patricia and demanding they stop all further contact and fraudulent claims. He also mentioned potential legal action for harassment, trespassing, and defamation, especially in light of the sheriff's visit and the baseless accusations she had tried to use as leverage. He made it clear they were walking a thin line, and one misstep could put them in serious legal jeopardy. But Patricia wasn't acting alone. That much was now obvious. Several other members of the HOA board were backing her, or at least too afraid to stand up to her. The letter I received had multiple signatures, suggesting this wasn't a rogue effort. This was coordinated, so I decided to respond in kind, not with aggression but with facts, transparency, and exposure. I gathered every document, email, message, and photograph I had compiled since the very first incident. I also reached out to several residents I'd come to know over the years, people who'd also had run-ins with the HOA. As it turned out, I wasn't the first target. Patricia had been running her own little regime for months, bullying residents into repainting homes, removing perfectly legal outdoor features, and even paying fees that had no basis in the original community bylaws. One elderly couple told me she had threatened to place a lien on their home if they didn't remove a flagpole that had been standing for over a decade. Another family said she'd accused them of harboring dangerous wildlife because their backyard bordered the woods. It was all the same pattern: intimidation through fake authority and misinterpretation of loosely written policies. That's when I knew the only way to stop this wasn't through private warnings. It had to go public. With permission from several neighbors, I compiled their stories and complaints into a comprehensive report. I created a digital document outlining Patricia's pattern of behavior: the harassment, the abuse of power, the baseless claims, and the repeated attempts to use the HOA as her personal enforcement squad. I included time-stamped photos, quotes from residents, legal analysis from my attorney, and even a timeline of events showing her obsession with controlling the community. I submitted the report directly to the county commissioner's office and the local newspaper. But more importantly, I sent it to every HOA member's inbox. No anonymous drop.
No subtle hints.
I put my name on it and attached every piece of evidence I had. My goal wasn't revenge. It was accountability. People deserved to know who they were dealing with and how far this person was willing to go to manipulate a position of authority. The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the neighborhood was buzzing. People started talking, comparing notes, and realizing they weren't alone. Residents who had stayed quiet out of fear now saw that someone had stood up and wasn't crushed for it. A few board members, clearly concerned about being implicated, suddenly started distancing themselves from Patricia. There were whispers of an emergency meeting to review leadership concerns. Someone even created a petition to initiate a recall vote for her removal as president. Patricia, predictably, didn't take it well. She sent out an email to the community trying to discredit my report, calling it a coordinated smear campaign by those resistant to community improvement. But no one was buying it anymore. Her power came from silence and submission, and those days were over. The county commissioner's office responded too. A representative acknowledged receipt of my report and confirmed they were reviewing whether any zoning violations or overreach had occurred. More importantly, they asked for more testimonies. That was the final blow. Now there was an official record, and Patricia couldn't erase it. By the end of the month, Patricia had resigned. It wasn't a graceful exit. She cited personal attacks and toxicity in the community as reasons for stepping down. But everyone knew the truth. Her web of intimidation had finally unraveled, and the people she had tried to dominate had turned the spotlight back on her. A new interim president was appointed, and one of the first things they did was clarify the boundaries of the HOA's jurisdiction. My property was officially and publicly acknowledged as outside their reach. No more surprise visits, no more threats, no more manipulation. The fallout didn't just free me. It woke up the entire community. People started pushing for transparency, revising outdated bylaws, and creating new checks to prevent another Patricia from rising again. What started as one woman's obsession with power ended up creating a wave of change she never intended and never wanted. And I, once just a quiet cabin owner minding my business, had unexpectedly become the spark that lit it all. The moment Patricia stepped down as HOA president, it felt like the heavy cloud that had hung over the neighborhood for months was finally lifting. But I knew the real work was just beginning. Removing her from power was one thing. Making sure she couldn't come back or continue to cause harm was another. Justice wasn't just about her resignation. It was about accountability and ensuring the community and my own property were protected from her type of abuse forever. The new interim president was a breath of fresh air. Calm, rational, and respectful of boundaries. Almost immediately, they organized meetings that included all residents, encouraging open dialogue. It was a relief to finally have a leadership that listened instead of shouted, that collaborated instead of controlled. But despite this progress, the memories of what Patricia had done didn't fade overnight. The harassment, the threats, the false accusations, they left scars. Many neighbors admitted feeling intimidated, afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. A few even confided they'd considered selling their homes to escape the toxic environment she'd created. I was no different. There were nights I lay awake thinking about the possibility of her escalating things further, maybe even resorting to legal action or worse. That's why I made the decision to press further. My lawyer and I began preparing a civil suit against Patricia for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about setting a precedent that no one, especially someone in a position of community power, could bully residents and get away with it. The legal process wasn't quick or easy. Patricia hired a lawyer too, of course, and tried to paint herself as the victim, the protector of community standards unfairly targeted by a disgruntled neighbor. Her defense was as predictable as it was weak, relying mostly on twisted interpretations of vague bylaws and baseless claims that I had somehow provoked her. But the truth was on my side. We had documentation of every interaction, every threat, every attempt she made to break into my cabin or intimidate me. The text messages, letters, the sheriff's visit, and the sworn statements from neighbors who had suffered similar treatment, all piled up like evidence in a courtroom drama. The more the case progressed, the clearer it became that Patricia's behavior was not only unethical but illegal. Then came the day of the mediation hearing. I remember sitting across the table from Patricia, watching her shrink behind her bravado. The mediator laid out the facts and made it clear that if we didn't reach an agreement, the case would proceed to court, which could mean costly litigation and public exposure for both sides. Patricia's lawyer suggested a settlement, but it was a token gesture, far from an apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing.
E stood firme.
The settlement I wanted was straightforward: a formal apology to the community, a public acknowledgement of her misconduct, and a legally binding agreement that she would cease all contact with me and any further harassment of residents. No sneaky inspections, no false reports, no threatening letters. After hours of back and forth, she finally relented. The agreement was drafted and signed within a week. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Patricia's name and her legacy were officially stained by the court record. No longer could she claim innocence or continue her reign of intimidation in secret. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The residents who had once been silenced now felt emboldened. Some held small gatherings to discuss how they could improve the HOA's governance, while others volunteered to help rewrite the bylaws, explicitly defining limits on what the HOA could and couldn't do. The toxic culture Patricia had nurtured was being dismantled piece by piece. But karma didn't stop there. A few months after the settlement, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that Patricia was struggling to find another leadership role in any nearby community association. Her reputation had preceded her, and most boards weren't willing to risk bringing someone with such a documented history of harassment on board. The same drive that had fueled her aggression now isolated her socially and professionally. I can't say I felt joy in that. It was just the natural consequence of actions. People in positions of power have a responsibility to use their influence wisely. When they abuse it, the fallout isn't just legal, it's personal. For me, the greatest satisfaction came from reclaiming my peace of mind. I could walk freely on my property again without worrying about surprise visits or threats. The cabin that had been a place of refuge became a symbol of standing up for what's right. It was proof that no matter how small or quiet you may seem, You don't have to tolerate bullying or abuse of power. Looking back, the whole ordeal was a hard lesson in boundaries, legal rights, and the importance of community vigilance. It showed me how one person's unchecked ambition can poison an entire neighborhood, but also how collective courage and clear evidence can restore balance. As life slowly returned to normal, I found myself reaching out to neighbors more often, building stronger relationships grounded in mutual respect rather than fear. I even started a small neighborhood watch program focused on communication and support instead of surveillance and suspicion. The goal was simple. No one should ever feel alone facing a figure like Patricia again. Justice, in this case, wasn't a dramatic courtroom victory or a sensational headline. It was the slow, steady reclaiming of fairness and dignity. It was the restoration of trust in the institutions meant to serve us, not control us. In the end, Patricia's meltdown, her desperate tantrums, and her threats didn't break me. They only made me stronger. They showed me the power of standing firm, the importance of documentation, and the value of community allies. When karma finally came knocking, it wasn't a coincidence. It was the natural order catching up with a woman who had forgotten that true leadership is about respect, not fear. And that's the story of how I refused to unlock my cabin, and how that refusal changed everything.